Yehuda Kurtzer is president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. He has a doctorate in Jewish studies from Harvard University and an MA in religion from Brown University, and is an alumnus of both the Wexner Graduate and Bronfman Youth Fellowship programs. Yehuda is the author of Shuva, The Future of the Jewish Past, a work of constructive theology that offers new thinking on how contemporary Jews can and should relate to our past while living profoundly in the present. As a fellow in the Institute's I Engage project, Yehuda writes and teaches widely on the central challenges facing Jewish life in both America and Israel, and how new Jewish thinking can help us stand up to these challenges. Reverend Dr. Judy Yates Siker is Research Professor of New Testament and Christian Origins at San Francisco Theological Seminary. This academic school year, she is visiting professor of New Testament at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. Judy was a fellow of Hartman Institute's first Christian Leadership Institute group, initiative group in 2008-9, and she is a steering committee member of New Paths, Christians Engaging Israel. Her teaching and research have focused on anti-Semitism in the New Testament with an emphasis on identity theory and first-century Jewish-Christian relations. She is co-chair of the Early Jewish Christian Relations Group of the National Society of Biblical Literature. In her role as Presbyterian minister, she continues to be involved in interfaith dialogue. Please join me in giving Yehuda and Judy a warm welcome to the JCCSF.
You're up.
I like it. Thank you so much. First, let me offer my profound gratitude to you for the invitation to participate in this important series of conversations that you folks are having this fall. It's an honor to be included in one of these conversations. It's also a privilege for me to have the opportunity to speak with Yehuda, whom I've only met by phone and email up before this evening, but who, as you have just heard, is the leader of the North American branch of an institute to which I am deeply indebted. My work with the Hartman Institute began in Israel when I was, as you just heard, part of the first cohort of the Christian Leadership Initiative, or Institute, and I continue to do work with them through my work on a project that we call New Paths, Christians Engaging Israel, and I hope and trust and plan that you will hear a little more about that as the evening goes on. And so I come tonight grateful for the opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts and to hear your thoughts and questions about this topic that is near and dear to each of our hearts. I don't pretend to come and speak for all Christians. There's a significant range of strongly held views within the world of Christianity, and I cannot and would not try to speak for all of them. There are, for example, a variety of images that come to mind for North American Christians when they hear the word Israel. For many, Israel is the Holy Land, that place where Jesus walked, the hallowed ground of the life and ministry of Jesus. And for other 21st century North American Christians, Israel is the Holy Land and the location of the final apocalypse, that end-of-time experience which they await and for which they long. They're often friends of Israel, but the motivation for their support is one to be pondered, I think. So no, I don't presume to come and speak for all Christians. That's an impossible task. But I'm happy to be here and offer you the perspective of one who finds herself in mainline Protestantism with all that entails these days. So let me offer a few remarks about the current state of affairs, something about how we arrived at this place, and perhaps a suggestion of where we may go from here. It will come as no surprise to you that we have a troubled past. From inception, there have been a number of different perspectives on Jews and Judaism within Christianity, and the New Testament images of Jesus in conflict with other Jews and teaching that's followed based upon these texts are evidence of a troubled past that must be recognized and addressed in a conversation such as we're having tonight. I think the passages in question are in large part the result of attempts of early Jesus followers to distinguish themselves from other Jews of the first century, to self-identify, if you will. And that often means that there will be an other. You can say who you are by often saying that which you are not. Many of you are no doubt familiar with these texts. It might surprise you to know that there are many Christians who are not familiar with these texts. Part of the work of New Paths, I promised you I'd get that in, is to help today's Christians recognize the extent of our troubled past and to learn how to address it and to learn how to move forward. Texts in the New Testament that have been used and abused against the Jews, texts that are mirrors onto the social realities of the day when Jesus' followers were beginning to differentiate themselves from others, includes some of the following. Matthew 23, 37 to 39. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent it. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you weren't willing. See, your house is left to you, desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Or the most horrible, in my opinion, and the opinion of many others, Matthew 27, 25. Then the people as a whole cried out, his blood be on us and on our children. But contrast that with Matthew 5, 17 to 18, a passage that's only in the Gospel of Matthew, a passage in which Jesus is said to have said, do not think that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Or flip back to the horrors of John in chapter 8, who has us read from the lips of Jesus, you are from your father the devil, and you choose to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. The same writer, however, who also says in chapter 4, for salvation is from the Jews. Paul also has writings in his letters that reflect different perspectives. You, brothers and sisters, became imitators of the churches of God in Christ that are in Judea, for you suffered the same things from your own compatriots as they did from the Jews, who killed both the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us out. The same Paul who writes in his letter to Romans, I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. As regards the gospel, they are enemies of God for your sake, but as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their ancestors, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Those are just a few scattered examples, and as you can see from just those few, it wasn't all negative. But I'm sad to report that the negative is what tended to stick. The negative is what tended to stick across the early centuries of Christianity, and we have in the writings of Eusebius and Augustine and Martin Luther, as we jump across the ages, much more anti-Jewish rhetoric that makes us blush, knowing that it is a part of our history, those of us who know that it is a part of our history. Underlying the entire tradition of rejection across these ages is the idea that the destruction of Jerusalem was regularly interpreted by Christians as a sign of God's judgment on the Jews. It was widely taught that exile is God's eternal punishment of the Jews for rejecting Jesus. Unfortunately, the idea that Jews have no legitimate national identity and no rightful place in the world took deep root in the Western world. Be a much happier evening for me if this was not the report that I had to give. But the Holocaust woke us up, at least stirred us. In the years following the Shoah, Christians had to begin to rethink their texts and had to begin to accept responsibility for their complicity, and if not their complicity, at least their silence. How sad it is to me that it took such a horrific event to call Christian attention to the kind of supersessionist and harmful perspectives that were being perpetuated in the Christian tradition up to that point. It's clearly still a work in progress, but there has been some significant progress. In the period from the time of the Shoah to the present, we begin to see statements affirming Jews and Judaism from both Catholic and Protestant groups. They signal a turning point in thought and history, particularly in Christian teaching about Jews and Judaism. They represent an attempt to formulate policies anew, free from the errors of the past. They represent attempts to express an awareness of God's various revelations, of God's will for all creation, and a commitment to remain true to one's faith in ways that are not detrimental to others. You may be familiar with the Catholic statement that we call Nostra Aetate. This was a part of the Second Vatican, and it was, in light of all that had gone before, a pretty amazing statement. The statements in Nostra Aetate include things like repudiating one of the pillars of the continual teaching of contempt, the claim that Jews were collectively culpable for Jesus' death. It also denounced anti-Semitism and any persecution of the Jews. It recalls Christianity's Jewish origins. It implicitly asserts that God's covenant with the Jews is permanent and unbroken, encouraged rather than further discouraged contact between Christians and Jews, and stressed the need for accurate biblical interpretation and religious education, and thankfully expressed no further interest in baptizing and converting the Jews. There has been in this time also the Anglicans who have made a number of reports. In one report from the late 1980s, says Christians in the West must not be allowed to forget how centuries of anti-Semitism led up to the unparalleled atrocity of the Holocaust in our century. In the Lutheran Church, we read in some of their statements a call for repentance and a call to appreciate the factors that gave birth to the state of Israel and to give prayerful attention to the circumstances that bear on the search for Jewish and Arab security and dignity in the Middle East. In the PCUSA, in the Presbyterian Church, in 2010, within a statement on dialogue with the Jews, it says, supersessionism is contrary to the core witness of the New Testament and not supported by the mainstream of the Reformed tradition. So it seems to me clearly that there are two realities in the 20th century that led many theologians and churches to re-examine their heritage. Negatively, it would be Christian complicity with Nazi anti-Semitism, and positively, the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Both of these factors, both of these realities led to some of the statements, the kinds of which I just shared with you. What we'll see is that while these statements focus primarily on the broad issue of Jewish-Christian relationship, re-examining covenantal language and laying out guidelines for mutual recognition and constructive dialogue, the place of Israel and the land is sometimes omitted from consideration, and divergence of opinion on this is to be noted. That sounds like a better side of my report. And now, however, I have to admit, the last 10 years or so have seen some less affirmative statements and actions, and have left many of us wondering, what's going on? For example, in 2003, the Episcopal Church called on President Bush to discourage further construction of the security barrier. In 2004, PCUSA began to talk about divestment. In 2005, the UCC had the Tear Down the Wall, the Lutheran ELCA, Peace Not Walls, the United Methodist Church started talking about divestment, and the beat goes on. And there have been other statements in recent years. Actions taken in 2012 and in 2014 with major denominations deciding to divest from companies that appear to be tied to products that promote violence in occupied Palestinian territories. We see that in PCUSA. We see that in United Methodist Church. What's driving these actions? I think that largely it's a cry for social justice and against what is perceived to be undue violence against the Palestinian people. I think in many ways it's born out of a desire to see peace in the Middle East. In some ways, it's an effort to make a statement to Israel that says the peace process is not going forward as it should. Churches who take a strong stance on social justice tend to see the situation in Israel as lopsided. Since the statehood in 1948 and the accomplishments of the Six-Day War, Israel's been able to take a stronger stand than ever. And Israel has a strength that it hasn't known before. And these statements seem to indicate that the mainline Protestant churches see Israel now as too strong, strong at the expense of those that they have displaced. How are these statements heard? I know how they're heard from my little part of Protestantism, which doesn't agree with the statements that have been made. However, I wonder how the Jewish community hears this, and it is not difficult at all for me to see that these statements can be heard as the all too familiar anti-Semitic cries of Israel's past. How can these churches, who are supposed to be the friends of Israel, be so apparently anti-Israel? We hope you're going to solve that situation tonight in our conversation. But let me just suggest that I think the answer has to come in these kinds of conversations. It has to come in dialogue. It's important, I think, that the churches begin to make clearer that not agreeing with everything Israel does not necessarily make them anti-Israel. Even some Israelis disagree with some of the decisions of the Israeli government. And it's important that Jews understand that not everyone who disagrees with Israel's politics is anti-Israel. It's important, I think, that churches realize how freighted some of this language is that gets tossed about and what damage can result. And I think it's important that Jews understand that Christians don't see themselves as singling out Israel for their opposition. And that I've heard as well. There's a lot of listening and a lot of new understanding on both sides that must be done. Throughout our history, we've been caught in the web of essentialist notions of identity, and the results have been tragic. From the beginning of Christianity, from the beginning of those early Jesus followers, there's been an us-them mentality and vocabulary as we have defined ourselves. That's nothing but danger coming when you have everything boiled down to an us-them mentality. There have been moments of recognition of the error of our ways among Christians, and there have been moments of progress. But as long as we continue to define people in essentialist categories, we're going to have trouble. The issues are bigger than Christians and Jews, pro-Israel, anti-Israel, Israelis, Palestinians, and so on. One of the lessons that I've learned in my work with the Hartman Institute and my work on New Paths is that the issues are much more complex than we could ever begin to imagine. We can't put ourselves in another's shoes, but it's imperative that we at least try them on. It's not an either-or situation, and the answer will not be yes or no, pro or con. We humans are far too complex for that. The answer, I think, is not to take a side, but to ask for a seat at the table. As a member of the New Paths team and with invitations such as the one offered me tonight, I have the privilege of engaging in rich conversations and of working with people who share my passion for encouraging new ways for Christians to engage Israel, searching for new language, searching for new points of entry. for Christian understanding of Jews and Judaism. Our history, both Christians and Jews, has been fraught with misunderstanding and crises. Through the courses that we at New Paths are designing for North American Christians and through conversations such as this one tonight, it's my hope that together we can replace the language and lens of crisis with the language and lens of shared values. The work is ongoing. The challenge of the ever-changing reality of the State of Israel calls us to honest engagement and daily assessment of how to be good conversation partners. Both Christians with Christians about Israel and Christians with our Jewish brothers and sisters. It's a conversation that must take place and that must continue to reach out to the God who can bring peace through and sometimes in spite of us. May it be so.
First of all, thank you, Judy. Those were stunning remarks. I want to thank my colleagues at the JCC as well, both Stephanie, Rachel, and others with whom we've been able to build a partnership over the last few years in trying to bring the content and conversations of the Hartman Institute into the San Francisco community. And this piece, this interfaith dialogue and sometimes intra-faith dialogue on Israel is a major feature of what we do, and we're grateful for a space, an audience, and conversation partners in this community who hold both the values of what it means to talk about Israel dear, but also the centrality of making that conversation one that is intellectually compelling as well as affectively compelling. In other words, it should be enjoyable as much as it is stimulating. I want to give my own take on the problem. And put it in a slightly different way, also with some recourse, as you did tonight, to some of the history that's gotten us here, but a little bit more of a contemporary political analysis of what seems to be the problem taking place that's emerging. And you gave a few examples. Obviously, the Presbyterian Church was perhaps the one that received the most attention in the organized Jewish community, and out of a sensibility that we may be portending a much bigger problem for years to come than the one that has materialized until now. And I want to, you also said at the outset you don't speak for Christians. I should probably say I don't speak for all Jews, but the instinct of a Jewish speaker is to get up and say, I do speak for all the Jews. But obviously I don't. I want to identify what I see as two central challenges that are creating the tension that exists today, not only between American Jews and American Christians with respect to the State of Israel, but also it's for a separate night, and those of you who are here for Rabbi Daniel Hartman and Imam Abdullah Antepli could also imagine the dialogue between American Jews and American Muslims, in which Israel has gone from being, at least for American Christians and American Jews, a place of agreement to a place of dissent. For American Jews and American Muslims, needless to say, American Jews and American Muslims actually cooperate and agree on a lot, and simply isolate Israel as the thing that they won't talk about, which yields a certain toxicity into those relationships. If Israel is a central feature of Jewish life to American Jews, but it can be identified as being other to Jewishness by folks who are not of that community, you can imagine the toxicity that gets created. The condition between Jews and Christians, however, is one that's quite different because of a lot of the post-Holocaust reasons that you articulated. I want to identify two challenges that I think have emerged, one that results of discourse and one that results of mythology. The discourse problem is, and I've heard this from Christian colleagues, part of the reason that it is increasingly difficult to sustain a serious conversation between Jews and Christians when it comes to the State of Israel is that if the post-Holocaust period produced some combination of guilt, reflection, a willingness by American Christians to listen to and follow the lead of the Jewish community when it came to the State of Israel. In the past 20 years, the internal Jewish discourse on Israel has become so polarized and so toxic that if you were on the outside of it, watching it, the way in which to identify what it means to stand with the Jewish people has become harder to see. Right? Put differently, It's no longer clear, I think, to many Christians standing on the sidelines what's fair and what's out of bounds in terms of talking about Israel, precisely because within the Jewish community it's no longer clear about what's fair and what's out of bounds. So if you were going to try to imitate or impersonate, if you're going to follow the lead of the organized Jewish community, that lead has become harder and harder to follow. So it's one problem that has nothing to do with theology, has nothing to do with history, but it goes to an internal Jewish problem that's being mapped out on those who think that they're our friends, right? So, and even the questions of divestment, questions of boycott and otherwise, are actually being debated in the context of inside the Jewish community. So to imagine that someone would think, I'm calling for boycott and divestment of Israel, but I'm doing so not because I am standing against Israel, but because I'm standing with Israel, is at least now within the realm of the plausible and possible. Even today, a number of left-wing Jewish intellectuals, but folks who have been very much within the mainstream of the Jewish community for years, intellectuals like Michael Walzer and others, today issued a statement saying that because of their stated positions in opposition to the two-state solution, folks like Naftali Bennett, who's actually a minister in the recently disbanded Israeli government, so a mainstream Israeli political figure, folks like Naftali Bennett should be sanctioned by the Jewish community and the international community. This is not the far left position, far left individuals within the Jewish community. These are folks who, by anyone's standard, are Zionists and part of the umbrella of the Jewish community. So to ask folks outside of the Jewish community to impersonate or imitate the Jewish discourse on Israel is to invite the same type of conflict. So one problem, which we can talk about some more, is the ways in which the dialogue with Christians merely impersonates or imitates a dialogue within the Jewish community that's become increasingly polarized. But I want to go a little bit deeper, and that is what I call the mythology problem. For most of Jewish history, and for most of Jewish history in terms of our own self-understanding as well as our relationship with Christians, and I apologize for the gross oversimplification of the pre-modern period, but I think it works. At least I'll test it out as an idea for tonight. For most of the pre-modern period, Jews lived in mythical time more than they lived in real time. That is to say, the narratives that we told ourselves comported to and sometimes redefined a mythological narrative with which we wanted to see and understand ourselves. This influenced the way Jews thought about prayer. This influenced the way Jews thought about and interpreted history. A classic example is the post-biblical holiday of Hanukkah, which comes up next week, right? In which even though it takes place after the biblical period, Jews look at a historical event that transpires to them and say, in response to that moment, blessed be you, O Lord our God, who commanded us to kindle the Hanukkah lights. Where did God command the Jewish people to light the Hanukkah lights? Well, that moment, that move, is an active Jewish memory called living in myth, in which you imagine that you're in a relationship to God, and God acts throughout your historical events, and you make selective choices to interpret those historical events as they conform to the mythological narrative that you've presented. Christianity did the same thing not only to itself, but to the Jewish community. And in many respects, a lot of the early Christian Jewish tensions that emerged in the advent of Christianity involved what you might call competitive myth. You know quite a bit about this as well. A classic competitive myth that existed between Christian intellectuals and Jewish intellectuals in the first few centuries of the Common Era pertained to the narrative of Jacob and Esau. In the Bible, Jacob and Esau are imagined as twins born of the same mother and wrestling and in conflict in the womb of their mother. So even before they were born, they were actually fighting with one another. And one is the older one, and one is the younger. And the prophecy that's given to the mother is that the younger will wind up being superior to the older. Both Jewish tradition and Christian tradition imagined that they were the Jacob and the other was the Esau. It's an incredible moment of what you might call competitive interpretation in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century of both traditions trying to situate themselves as part of the same mythology and imagining that that discourse of mythology was the way in which they would achieve their own legitimacy and authenticity. It's actually a little bit easier for Christianity with the Jacob and Esau thing, right? Who's younger and who's older? Anybody know how the rabbis make it Jacob and Esau, that they would be younger than Christianity? So if Christianity becomes the Roman Empire, right? So the Roman Empire actually is older and bigger, and Jacob, as Judaism, becomes younger. Doesn't perfectly work, but that's the game of competitive mythology, right? You want to situate yourself within a particular narrative and imagine yourselves through that narrative, through that mythology, as being in relationship to the past and to the present. The consequence of living a mythology, however, wind up being devastating, especially for the Jewish people. If you live as the object in someone else's myth, if you are subjected to paying the price for the crucifixion of Jesus, you are living out someone else's myth and someone else's fantasy, and you are embodying, as the Jewish people did for way too long, you are embodying a mythical narrative that you didn't create for yourself, but is being played out for you. Another example that I think about a lot. In my own graduate work, I studied the Jewish communities that existed in the Roman Empire that were neither Jerusalem nor Babylonia. And these Jewish communities lived for a lot longer than people know, in Rome, in Syria, in Turkey, throughout Asia Minor, in Egypt, and elsewhere. But nobody knows the story of these Jewish communities, and the reason why these stories of these Jewish communities are often not told is because they don't fit into the Jewish myth of ancient history, and they don't fit into the Christian myth of ancient history. Christianity imagined that if you had Jews living throughout the Roman Empire who weren't converting to Christianity, that was a failure of Christianity, which was supposed to take those people and make them Christians. And so Christianity, even though it preserves a lot of Jewish intellectual history, doesn't preserve the literature of the people who are actually living next door to them, because that's a source of embarrassment. And for Jews, for the rabbis who wind up writing the intellectual history of Jewish history, the idea that Jews would exist not under the thumb of rabbinic leadership is a source of embarrassment to them too. And so you get this unwitting conspiracy of mythology, an unwitting conspiracy of Jewish mythology and Christian mythology that winds up eliminating a narrative of actual Jews from real history. This goes on for quite some time, and as you stopped this story in the Holocaust, I'll stop that story as well. The Holocaust, one of the consequences of the Holocaust, I think, for the Jewish people, you talked about it for Christianity, which is kind of a deep awareness of what this narrative or what this history has yielded us, what might be the implications or consequences for Christianity in its role, not in necessarily perpetrating the Holocaust, but making the conditions possible through the history of anti-Semitism for something like this to occur. For Jews, however, the Holocaust has had a different function, which in our mythology narrative is the end of mythological time for the Jewish people. It has to end mythological time. The Holocaust requires of the Jewish people a kind of re-entry into history, which requires us to take this is what Zionism does. It requires us to take a responsibility for building a society in our own terms. Do whatever you need to do. Move out of this mythical construct that we've told ourselves and that the world has told us, which is that we are kind of the isolated people that doesn't get to live by the rules of sovereignty that the rest of the world does. Zionism was, in many respects, and religious Zionism is its own problem, which we can talk about. Zionism, in many respects, was the demythologization of Jewish history for Jews. Enough already. Stop telling me some story about Jewish destiny. It doesn't have to be messianic. One way to think about this is that in the pre-modern period, Jews have two poles of how they think about time. One is exile, and one is redemption. Exile means everything is wrong. You're not in the place you want to be because you've been punished by God. And redemption is perfection, in which there's no gap between what you want for the world and what you're actually living in. That's why you get great fantasies of what the Messianic age will be, right? There's no cats in America and the streets are paved with cheese, right? Everything that we want is at our disposal. What Zionism comes along and says, enough already. Enough of the category of exile, because this has bred for us conditions that we can no longer live in. But stop fantasizing about redemption, right? Stop making the perfect the enemy of the good. Can we as Jews take responsibility for living in our own space, making our own rules, making mistakes? What will happen if we actually test ourselves with power in a way that we in Jewish history have never been able to test us with? And for the first 50, 60 years of this return from myth to history, what you talked about, of the Christian kind of backing off, right, made this possible, that it wasn't You didn't have Christians looking over Jews' shoulders and checking what it is that we were doing, what it is that the state of Israel was meant to represent. But there seems to be a return to myth that's taking place in the context of the Jewish community internally, and what's reawakening the conflict between Jews and Christians on Israel is a return to myth. You do something for 2,000 years, the idea that you're going to suddenly stop living in mythology and move into history is not sustainable. So, for instance, in the Jewish community proper, this is a very tricky and a little bit of an edgy example, so bear with me. In recent times, especially around the Gaza war, and especially with the persistence of terror attacks, some of which, like the one that took place in the synagogue in Jerusalem 3 weeks ago, have a certain medieval quality to them. Right? In that terror attack, the terrorists came not with suicide vests, which is a unique modern phenomenon, but with axes and chopped people's arms off, right? And hacked people to death. And one of the phenomena that has started to emerge in commentaries on this is a kind of seeking and longing to understand this through mythological language. Where have we seen this before? So I saw one interpreter, one person called it was like a return of the Kishinev pogroms. Or another commentator, well known in the Jewish community and an Israeli, has started to use the term Amalek in reference to terrorists who wind up attacking Jews. Amalek is the ultimate mythological category for Jews. It is the ultimate imagined other. It is the people in the wilderness who attack you when you're down, who Jewish history has imagined as being not just the anti-us, but anti-God. To the extent that we have an antichrist, it's Amalek, right? Because the Bible says the war between God and Amalek is infinite. It goes on forever. And we're the people of God, and Amalek are those who stand on the outside. Now, when Jews start to re-embrace the language of mythology, it comes as no surprise that Christians, once again, are also re-embracing the language of mythology. How long can it be for us as Jews to ask Christians to abandon the mythological frames with which Christians understand the world and merely allow us to live out a political historical reality in serious dialogue? Are we ultimately rejecting the Christian right and the Christian responsibility, not right, the Christian responsibility to use your own theological language to understand the history with which you're living? And how long can we demand that they're not allowed to do that anymore? What we've done for the past 50, 60 years is we've made Israel engagement in the Jewish community an incredibly political activity. Right? Israel, those who stand up for Israel do so with a deep secularity. Institutions like AIPAC and the American Jewish Committee and others, for all of the good work that they do, are fundamentally secular institutions. They're not about the Jewish mythical narrative as much as they are about Jewish survival in the moment. And what I'm sensing, and this is just a hypothesis, could be wrong, what I'm sensing is that era of suspending Jewish mythological time and moving into Jewish historical time is nearing an end. That we as Jews are actually longing to understand ourselves in our history as part of a longer narrative arc in which we live as part of a myth, in which this moment in history is not totally anomalous to all moments that come before. And I sense also from our Christian brethren that they too are living in mythology and seeking and longing a return to that mythology. And we're left with a number of big questions. One of which is, how do you live in mythology in a moment that you've never had in your past? Right? What Jews have in terms of power is unprecedented in Jewish history. Young Jews especially are seeking mythological language. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means language of importance. Are seeking a language of importance for this. What does it mean for Jews to have power? What does it mean for us to wield it? How do you maintain this profound story of what Israel means to the Jewish people and its centrality and its importance when you're not going to do everything right, or some days when it looks like you do nothing right? How do you sustain a relationship not only with your own tradition, but with people of another tradition when you're living in categories that are unprecedented before? What happens when we don't get to dictate how someone else wants to interpret what we're doing? Part of what I think has happened between Jews and Christians is that if Christians are now understanding the Jewish wielding of power in ways that are disproportionate, not disproportionate for any human being, but disproportionate to the narrative of how power is supposed to be exercised, do we as a Jewish community, how long do we get to use the guilt narrative to push back on Christians and say, because of the Shoah, you don't get to say anything to us? And I guess this is what I want to conclude with. That it's possible long term that a Jewish insistence that the state of Israel is basically a secular project could be how we want to interpret it permanently. And the fact that religious Christians come along and have a different understanding means we have to simply do political work. A lot of Jewish-Christian relations in the last 30, 40 years around the state of Israel has been explicitly political. This is what I want you to do. This is what I don't want you to do. These are the boundaries of how you should act and behave. But theological work is of a totally different meaning. Theological work is not, this is how I want you to act and behave, but this is how I want you to understand me. And for Jews, it's not clear long term that we will be able to dictate to others how their mythological frames are meant to understand us. What I think has to happen is that we as a Jewish community have to be a little bit better about doing that mythological work ourselves. How do we understand ourselves? How do we understand Israel as a feature of Jewishness? And only then can we turn to people of other religions and ask them to identify with and relate to that narrative that we seek to tell about ourselves. Thank you.
We have some time for some questions. Before we start, I have a request from our security team. If any of you have a Jaguar parked outside in the white zone, they are going to tow it if you don't move it. Okay. All right. So if you have a question, I'm going to ask you to please raise your hand and wait for me to come to you with the mic because we are recording. Any questions? Okay.
Thank you. I know this is a religious dialogue, and you touched on this, I think, but one of the things that brings us together is that we're all Americans, and as Americans, we search for common solutions to, problems at home and abroad that our government's involved in. And there's, such horrible lack of collaboration in our government that it's kind of like, how can we expect to solve something so far away when we can barely talk to each other here at home? And I'd just love to hear your points of view on that as well. Just how local and national politics has made these conversations even more difficult because it's such an us versus them game here at home.
It's an excellent question, and I think part of what I would want to say is that in the kind of conversation that we're having tonight, in the kind of conversation that I think Yehuda and I both agree are so significant, one of the really difficult points is what is the point of entry? Are we coming at this conversation out of our various theological perspectives? Are we coming at it out of our political perspectives? Are we coming at it out of our national perspectives? And it all gets blurred. One of the things in terms of the work that the team that I work with on New Paths is trying to do is even initially to be able to say, let's see if we can't become more educated about what's going on, and at the same time realize that when we move, and we move in and out of these areas, but when we move from Jewish-Christian dialogue or Jewish-Christian relations into the topic of Israel and the land, that's not ours to solve. I mean, let me say there's no shortage of North American Christians who think that it is. But it's not. It's not ours to solve. And so we can have an opinion on it, and I think we can become much more educated so that we can have much more intelligent conversations about it. But we need to let go of the hubris that says, let me tell you what you should do, because that no longer works, nor should it work. It's just one response to
I'll take a different tack on it. Much has been made over the last 20, 25 years of the demise of some notion of Jewish consensus. I don't believe that they're really ever, we're not exactly the people of consensus, but for a lot of the 20th century, there was some sense of what you could talk about in public and what you couldn't talk about in public, and that has basically disappeared. The one way to salvage it is to say we're not unique to this problem, right? It's just that there's a polarized political culture, and Jews, by virtue of the fact that have successfully become Americans, tried to become Americans and succeeded, are simply now, there's Jewish Democrats and Jewish Republicans, and we're merely imitating the political polarization that exists elsewhere. I guess putting it in what's disappointing about that answer is when you say all you are is the product of your environments, rather than saying that your tradition, your heritage, your culture is supposed to actually challenge you to be above the prevailing social conditions. That's exactly what it means to try to be an aspirational people, is that you don't simply say, because of the cultures that you live in, you become entirely, you absorb all of their problems and just embody them. I guess in this context of a Jewish-Christian dialogue, I think the question that's at the core of all of this is religion going to be allowed to be the source of the problem, or is religion going to be imagined to be a solution to these problems, right? And right now, perhaps because the loudest religious voices tend to be radical ones, and the loudest religious voices tend to act in ways that are deeply disruptive to political processes, it's not hard to imagine that religion across the world is coming across as the cause of the problems much more than as the cause of the solutions. What I think we're trying to do here is by actually not just sitting together, and it's not just agreeing, it's actually by deeply disagreeing, by doing it in a way that doesn't result in violence, but results in what do I need to do to understand the perspective that you come from, and what do you need to do to understand the perspective I come from. You're trying to reposition that religion, which has for a long time held a sway over the human imagination, as a discourse of authenticity and meaning, right? That try as modernity has tried for a long time, it has not been able to make religion go away. This is a discourse that still matters to people. Are we going to source within those traditions the type of language and the type of possibility that uses religion to be a solution to the world's conflicts rather than simply a cause? And in that respect, one would hope that people of faith would not merely say, well, red state, blue state, right? I'm on this side, you're on that side. But people of faith are precisely the type of people who would say, because we're committed to a certain discourse of authenticity and meaning, we're going to enter into that discourse as a means of actually achieving social change.
I'm a Christian. I don't know how many Christians are here tonight. I do not know a great deal about Jewish faith. But I love my Jewish brothers and sisters as I love my Christian brothers and sisters, because to me that is the very basis of the Christian faith. Love one another as I have loved you. I can't argue scripture with you, Reverend. I'm not that knowledgeable. But my question really is to you. I'm wondering, what do you want me to be so apologetic about tonight as a Christian? Because that's how you've made me feel. I don't know why you, as a Christian leader, feel we Christians should be apologetic. I don't blame or dislike Jewish people for the crucifixion of Christ. I understand the Holocaust. I don't understand Israel and Palestine, but I'm trying to learn. But maybe you can explain to me what I'm supposed to be apologetic for.
I'll start with an apology. How's that? For leaving you feeling that way. Not you. My hope is not that you would leave here tonight feeling personally apologetic. It was a larger statement of in these sweeping generalizations that we've had to make tonight about Christians. It is within our Christian history, it's within our Christian heritage that the situation that led to the Holocaust was able to happen. That doesn't mean individually any of us in this room who are Christians have spent our lives interpreting our text that way. And in the churches where I teach and preach, there are many people who had no idea that John 8 is even in their Bible. It's like, what do you mean Jesus said your father is the devil? We don't, in many Christian circles, that's not even talked about. But what I do think is important as contemporary Christians is to be aware of what is a part of our past. Whether we have interpreted the text that way or not, it has been there and it has gone on, and it is a part of our sacred text that we have to wrestle with. When we get right down to it, we have to wrestle with it. And I think that it is admirable that this is not anything that has ever occurred to you. Would that all of Christian history was that way, but it isn't. And so I think it is important that 21st century Christians are aware of the history of Christianity and the kinds of things that have gone on, whether they knew they went on or not, and to be able to say, okay, let's start from here. Let's try to understand how was it that for centuries there was this sort of built-in anti-Semitism, supersessionism, replacement theology. Much of that in contemporary lay Christianity are terms that people don't even use. But when we get to a discussion like this, we need to be aware of that. We need to be aware of our past, and we need to be aware that the future of conversation is going to be possible when people have the kind of attitude that you have, that says, I never thought that. I never believed that. I don't think that now, and then can go on. But if we're caught, consciously or unconsciously, being anti-Semitic or accepting things in the biblical text because simply because they're in there and not addressing the pain that they can cause, then I think we don't bring all that we can bring to the table. You're welcome. Thank you for your questions.
Yeah, I'm curious. Both of you are housed, or I'll hold it. Okay, both of you are housed here in the Bay Area. Is that correct?
I actually live in Los Angeles. I divide my time.
Okay, West
up
Coast.
And down the Bay. Yes.
And you are
New York.
East Coast. Okay. So I'm curious about this kind of conversation, not on the coast, but in the Midwest and in the South, and in Europe, and in other countries where there are many Christians besides Europe and outside of the United States, Latin America, and other parts of the world. How does this conversation play out in those areas?
Well, since we're not there. Well, I'll just keep bringing up New Paths till all of you want to know so much more about it that you're going to be looking it up on the web. But it's a great way to begin to answer that question. One of the things that we're doing with the New Paths work is to try to introduce this course for North American Christian churches all over the U.S. And we've just begun to get some traction, but we have begun to see the kinds of things that we're teaching being taught in churches, not just on the coast. Our team is from across the U.S. There are 7 of us, and 5 from the U.S. and 2 from Jerusalem. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to do. And I don't know about conversations from Hartman in the...
Well, look, I would say 2 things. One is, one of the arenas where Jewish-Christian dialogue needs to happen in a much more serious way is actually in Jerusalem proper, which actually eliminates the need to mass market across America, because actually a lot of Christians come to the land of Israel, and they come to the land of Israel oftentimes and see the kind of the places where Jesus walked, and don't necessarily encounter a modern Israel as a central Jewish discourse. So I'd just say, programmatically or prescriptively, one way to make it a little bit less of a regional conversation is to start doing this kind of work in Israel proper. And the other thing I would just say about Europe is there's a kind of, it's a topic for another night, but I just want to, there's something kind of related to it here that I want to throw in there. There's a prevailing narrative that started to emerge in the Jewish community about, we're seeing in Europe what we saw in the 1940s, a return to profound anti-Semitism and the demise of Jewish communities there. I actually think it goes back to the mythological narrative. A lot of Jews living in Europe today actually, from their perspective, anti-Semitism has been there and always was there. And this is actually a moment in which they are looking for a deeper and richer relationship to Jewishness than they ever have wanted to. And so from the outside perspective, it looks like a return to mythology. We're going back into the Middle Ages. But for a lot of European Jews, they're actually reclaiming their Jewish heritage in very powerful ways for the first time. So I think that in and of itself could become an entry point for a serious Jewish-Christian conversation in Europe, when you actually have people capable of participating from within the discourse of their own tradition. It makes the vibrancy of a discourse with the other even more powerful.
Thanks. Yesterday I had the pleasure and privilege of listening to Rabbi Michael Melchior, who was visiting the Bay Area. And he has a program in Israel of where he brings together clergy and others from the Islamic movement, even Hamas, and Jews. And his purpose is discussion, dialogue. And they've been talking. And he said that it has been quite successful. And he gave one example when the chief rabbi was on the radio after the incident at the synagogue. One of the things he said is that none of the Islamic leaders said anything about what happened. So Rabbi Melchior tried to he called some of his Islamic friends and said, would you say something? They all said, yes, we would. Then the difficulty was getting them on the radio. But at least they're thinking this way. And, hopefully that's a beginning for an understanding between people. And I don't really have a question. I just wanted to make sure that people knew that something is happening, and you probably know about it. So, I don't know, maybe everybody in Bay Area heard Michael Melchior last night, but you're the third person today who told me about this thing from Melchior. So this is actually, it's very important. And the reason it's important is because for a long time, the leadership, both on the Israel side and the Palestinian side with respect to the peace process, thought that the peace process was going to happen outside the parameters of the religious. And that meant the religious communities both in Israel and among the Palestinians, on the prevailing idea that it was essentially a secular political process that would just carve up the land into two different places, and the people who felt a deep sense of loyalty to land from a theological perspective would just get over it. That was the kind of prevailing wisdom for a long time with the peace process. And really the architect of it, and I'm a big fan of his, but this I think he really missed, was Peres. The real architect of this ideology was Shimon Peres, for whom his vision of what the state of Israel was not just a secular vision, but it was an incredibly cosmopolitan vision of the new Middle East with, it'll be a place like Europe with no boundaries, and it's not a great analogy. But that vision took for granted that once you actually got the rational people, and it was implicitly anti-religious, the rational people could actually agree on political outcomes, you'd be able to corral the religious. And there's an awareness now, not only that
they didn't succeed in Israel-Palestine in suppressing religion as a serious organizing principle. Like, early Zionism thought religion in Israel was going to be a short-lived 10, 20-year phenomenon, one generation. They assumed the ultra-Orthodoxy would just give way to Zionism, and they gambled wrong there too. Religion has actually been on the rise, and in Israel today, they now say that religious Zionism or observant Zionism constitutes something about 20% of the population. So religion has become not only a stronger discourse, but much more centrally connected to the political process. I think everybody is aware now that if you're going to achieve a final status outcome for sure, but even short-term incremental change, it's going to actually have to go through the discourses of religion rather than around it. So these examples of that kind of encounters between imams and rabbis and priests are critical. They feel a little bit like a drop in the bucket, right? So these people talked and they all agree that it's bad, but the louder people wind up winning. But the long-term proposition is the willingness to sit in a type of theological conversation that most policy people are uncomfortable doing. And there's something that has to be done to bridge that gap, so that policy is not a secular world and religion is not a place where the policy gets sold. I'll say honestly, personally, it's not a space that I'm hugely comfortable in. That may seem weird. I'm much more interested in a discourse of Jewishness that's about ideas than I am about the theology itself. But I know in conversations over the last couple of years with Muslims, for instance, I had a Muslim colleague when I was teaching a class on Zionism to a group of American Muslims. And one of the participants in the class said to me something to the effect of, I understand religious Zionism, right? I get that. But secular Zionism means you're trying to claim ownership of a land based on a tradition that you don't believe in. So that's actually a really good conversation. What's the theoretical framework by which a secular Jew actually is making the claim to this tradition? Now you can answer that, but what he really was looking for was an authentic religious response to the question he was asking, and he wanted to be in dialogue there too. So, obviously both of these processes have to happen simultaneously. I'm not trying to elevate the religious discourse over the secular discourse as much as to say any resolution to the conflict, much less serious dialogue that we can have here with folks of other faiths, is going to require us to enter into that space rather than trying to avoid it.
Very hesitant hand. Very hesitant hand.
Thank you very much for your opinions this evening. I learned a great deal. But I was curious to know what your thoughts are about the, a movement in Israel to declare it a Jewish state, to sort of abandon the secular aspect a little bit more. And I'm just trying to understand, as an American Jew, what the implications of that would be. Thank you.
So I can give my thoughts on this. I don't know if you have other ones, but look, the particular moment that Israel's in right now with this nation-state bill, it's been in discussions for some months and now got advanced and won't go anywhere for the next 3 months until there's a new government. They're born out of a constitutional problem, which is that there is no constitution. And the only legal frameworks by which Israel's self-defined identity as being a Jewish and democratic state are some language to that effect in the Declaration of Independence, which has precedent value but not really legal value, and then in the Basic Law that was passed as part of a constitutional process in the early 90s, in which Israel declared its status as a Jewish and democratic state. Since then, those frameworks of Jewish and democratic state have been the kind of poles of Israeli policy. How do you sustain your identity as a Jewish state, by which I think Israel meant to say Jewishness is its ethnicity, the dominant ethnicity, not its dominant religion. And what I would like it to say is Israel is as Jewish as democratic principles allow, and not as democratic as Jewish principles allow. Right? So Jewishness becomes the characteristics or the texture of essentially a democratic society, but that your primary goal is the affirmation of democratic values. The initial legislation that's trying to be advanced now was actually advanced to try to shore up the democratic quality of the state of Israel. It got hijacked. And when it got hijacked by the right, it got shifted into shoring up much more affirmatively
the Jewish character of the State of Israel. Now, as I said, Jewish and democratic don't have to be in conflict as long as you understand the relationship between them. That Jewishness goes to the texture and the national character, and democracy is the basic operating system. But it's possible that when someone plays with that, you could actually change the cocktail and you turn it into an ethnocracy rather than a democracy. That movement is underway in the State of Israel. It's underway in part because of perceived external threats, right? If we have enemies surrounding us, we want to take this moment, and it's not unique in the history of nationalism, take this moment to affirm the pronounced national quality of the homeland. In theory, is it a terrible thing to pass a law that affirms Israel's right to be both a Jewish and democratic state? No. I'm of the personal view that this version of the law and the timing, right, the timing of doing it when there's actually a tremendous amount of fear among Israelis has the consequence towards other minorities who are not Jewish of sending a really inflammatory message. So I would just like to see a separation of the conversation between the theoretical framework, which is an incredibly important conversation for both Israelis and American Jews to be involved with, which is how do we affirm Israel's democratic character while also making possible, our vision of what the Jewish state is, to separate that as a valid conversation from a particular law that may actually not help us in this particular moment.
I would only add to that that I appreciate your raising that question. And I think as an American, it is a particularly important question to raise. And my work with the Hartman Institute has given me the language of talking about that so that we're not talking about a theocracy, we're talking about a nation which is as Jewish as democracy will allow. I mean, that's a phrase that is often used when we talk about that. But I think it's important for Americans to hear that. It also reminds me, as you talk about the changes that are going on right now, how important it is that we not learn a little bit and then stop, because just about the time you think you got a hold of something, then 3 other things happen. And but it is very significant, I think, for Americans to understand that initially we're not talking about a theocracy, a Jewish state that happened to have some democracy in it, but a democracy that was a Jewish homeland, and yet the story's not finished being written.
Yeah, I just want to add one other thing on that, and this is one of these places, and some of my Israeli colleagues wouldn't appreciate this. It is what it is. This is one of these places where I actually think the American Jewish community has an enormous role to play. When it comes to issues like democracy and religious pluralism, there are voices in Israeli society who are desperate for American Jews to make their voices heard on these issues as an act of support rather than an act of disloyalty, right? As an act of affirming what it means, and it requires for American Jews to have a deeper understanding of what it means to be an American Jew who's in relationship to the national homeland of the Jewish people but doesn't live in it, right? So for American Jews, a lot of the anxiety around weighing in on those issues is because of a combination of guilt and confusion about what that's supposed to mean. But this is a moment for American Jews to say, actually, we don't need Israel to be the exact same democracy that we have here, but let's use what we've learned actually about living in the context of a democracy in ways that could be useful for our Israeli friends. There are certainly a lot of Israelis who are eager for that conversation to come into play. A lot of what has happened in the last 25 years in terms of the resurgence of Jewish pluralism in the State of Israel has happened because of a productive diaspora-Israel conversation, and this is a moment. And to that effect, it's not common that mainstream Jewish leaders will write an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that is critical of Israeli policy when it comes to security or war. But last week, Rabbi David Ellenson, was the president of Hebrew Union College, and Deborah Lipstadt, one of the leading historians of the Holocaust and an incredibly important moral voice in the American Jewish community, co-wrote an op-ed critical of this bill in the Wall Street Journal. And it signaled, it's picking your spots of what it means to be a loving critic. That the types of people who are willing to kind of put their credibility on the line at a moment like this to say, we're not criticizing you because we're far away and we don't know what you're up against.
We're being critical because we actually believe in a shared enterprise of building this Jewish and democratic state, and this is a misdirect.
Thank you. I think that was a great question, and I also just want to echo that we are grateful to have the Hartman Institute helping us in this discussion. Also, thank you both so much for coming. Join us for the third and final program in February, and everyone have some snacks and some coffee, and get home safely tonight. Thank you for coming.